resist in our music. We are the revolution.
People in the West Bank, it's rebirthing the Palestinian community again.
We can do it!
We didn't want their pity.
What did you want?
We wanted to go home.
Welcome to this panel discussion in the Leeds Palestinian Film Festival around the film Jews Step Forward. My name is Carol Burns. I know you will have been expecting John Battle, former Leeds West MP, and unfortunately he's ill today and I'm taking his place. I'm a member of the Leeds Justice and Peace Commission and Pax Christi, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event in partnership with those two organisations and the Palestinian Film Festival. I'm delighted to welcome our panel. And first of all, Pat Gaffney, who is the former General Secretary of Pax Christi in the UK, the International Catholic Movement for Peace. She's been on many fact-finding and solidarity visits to Israel and Palestine and led an alternative peace pilgrimage to the region. Dr. Alice Rothschild is a retired US physician, women's health activist, author, filmmaker, steering committee member of Jewish Voice for Peace, Health Advisory Council, and one of the interviewees in the film. And Adam Said is a Palestinian student of Arabic and politics at the University of Leeds, cinema lover and activist in the apartheid off-campus student-led network. And he's also told us that he's half Czech as well. So, wow, a really international panel. So thank you very much to everyone who sent questions in advance. I've tried to group them together so that they are easier to answer, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all the questions. So if I start off with the first question, and this was from Jane, and she would be very interested to know, first of all, the difference between Judaism and Zionism. But then she's got another couple of following questions, so probably Alice may want to start off with that. But then her follow-up questions are, does Zionism preclude peaceful coexistence with Palestinians? And how can Judaism be used to challenge Zionism and not reinforce it? So Alice, if you would start for us, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. From my point of view, Judaism is a religion. It sometimes is considered a cultural grouping. It's a set of beliefs and a whole historical, cultural and religious history of fighting oppression and siding with the weak and being a light unto the nations. And there's all these ideas that come along with the word Judaism. Zionism is a political national movement that was born in the 1800s and has been fully expressed by the creation of the State of Israel. So Zionism is not a religion. It's very, very different. There is also what I would say a more spiritual Zionism, sort of the Zionism of my Orthodox grandfather, who believes that, the Messiah is going to come sometime, but it's not happening right now, and it does not involve founding a state that's very militaristic and nationalistic and privileges Jews over everyone else. So they're two very different words that often get confused. Now,
So-
does Zionism preclude getting along with Palestinians? I think the main problem with political Zionism is that it inherently involves privileging Jewish citizens in Israel over everyone else. So it's inherently racist in its formulation and in its treatment of non-Jews. Now, if there was a return to a more egalitarian Zionism that's more a spiritual, religious feeling, that's a whole nother ballgame. But right now in our world, Zionism as it is currently practiced does preclude treating Palestinians as equal people, as equal citizens, as people who have a history and a yearning and aspirations that are equal to Jews. And that is highly problematic.
And do you think that Judaism can be used to challenge Zionism and not reinforce it?
Well, Judaism as a religion has many, many wonderful things about it. So if you take the wonderful part of it, the part about, as I said, siding with the oppressed, working for justice, working to heal the world, tikkun olam, those kinds of themes are totally compatible with being in peace and working as equals with Palestinians. And in fact, many, many young Jewish folks in my world who are actually very religious use religious tenets to justify their practices and their ability to get along with Palestinians and to work as allies.
That's great. Pat, I don't know whether you want to say anything about Christian Zionism at all.
Oh my goodness.
It might come up later, but I just thought we ought to just mention that it exists.
No, that's right. And in a way, I think it was really interesting that the film dealt with Zionism and looked at the history of the movement that was responding to real problems and a real crisis. And I think it's probably helpful always to look at the historical development of projects and programs, because often they're rooted in trying to achieve some kind of justice. We know from our end of things that it was partly our creation of problems with the Balfour Declaration that allowed the Zionism of an ideal to be turned into a kind of national project. And I think, therefore, we have to kind of take our responsibility as part of that, creating that approach and growth of that kind of Zionism. And of course, it was out of that a lot of the ideas of Christian Zionism also emerged. Many of the people who were part of that political process at the time in our government were part of this Christian Zionist vision of the world. Today, I think Christian Zionism, as I see it from here, but also from a global perspective, I find it extremely powerful and extremely frightening. I made a visit last October to Israel and Palestine, and there was an enormous gathering in Jerusalem of tens of thousands of Christian Zionists from around the world. And, they're rich, they're powerful, they have a strong voice. But, when one looks at the vision that they're upholding, it's not a vision that has the Jews within its perspective for the future. So I find it politically and religiously extremely worrying, extremely dangerous, and almost something that, as a person of faith, I can't get my head around. So I think Christian Zionism is a major problem. Maybe it will disappear slightly with the change of government in the US if the evangelicals feel, but that's another question, another issue.
Yes, which we may come to later, actually. There's a little bit about that. Adam, I don't feel that you've got to answer, but I don't know whether you've got a perspective on how it feels from your point of view.
Well, thank you, Alice and Pat, for answering those really important questions. And I think it's a great start to the conversation because it grounds a lot of the misconceptions, or it gets rid of a lot of the misconceptions that people might have about, if they still have them after watching that film, obviously, which would be probably really hard. I always think, and I sort of follow the writing and the thoughts of Dr. Ramzi Baroud, who's a Palestinian living in the US, and he's a writer, and he's from Gaza. on the importance of centralizing the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian perspective, because we are the indigenous people of the land. So it's really important when sometimes when I have conversations with people here in the UK, and it steers towards Zionism, it becomes a theoretical debate about religion. It becomes a theoretical debate about philosophy, nationalism, and colonialism. I think what we need to remember is it's important to look at Zionism from the perspective of the Palestinians, how they experience Zionism. So it's all well and good for someone to say, I'm a Zionist, but I'm just a cultural Zionist. But what does it mean when you support the existence of a state which has caused the ethnic cleansing of my ancestors from that place, right? Which denies the link of an indigenous population to their homeland. This has very serious implications on the ground. So I really appreciate, that there needs to be a debate about and a distinction, obviously, between Judaism and Zionism. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that this misconception is being made. It's being, in my opinion, weaponized against pro-Palestine, or I want to say pro-human rights voices, right? This conflation between Judaism, Zionism, and labeling people anti-Semites is obviously one of the weapons that is used by, let's say, counterinsurgents or reactionary forces to shut progressive voices down, right? But crucially, looking at the way how the indigenous population of Palestine have experienced this colonial ideology of Zionism in the state-building project of creating Israel, and which was obviously, and the ultimate expression of that, the epitome of that was the Nakba, right, in 1948. It's really central and it's really important. So for me as a Palestinian, Zionism means what Alice said, the idea that somehow there are people who are more privileged, or they have more rights to a land which I come from, and they can stop me from entering it, and they can dictate how I interact with people who live there as well, and they have the ultimate supremacy over that land. And this obviously relates to whether or not, and this is my final thought on this topic, whether or not Zionism precludes or stops the coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis. In my opinion, it does. Because how can you ever base a society on a supremacist ideology? You can't do that. You will always get to a point where we are right now, where you have a one-state reality, which is practicing apartheid, where the indigenous population of the land doesn't have the same rights wherever you go. It doesn't matter if it's Gaza, it doesn't matter if it's the West Bank, or if it's East Jerusalem, or Jaffa, or Nasra, or Nazareth, It's all the same. Palestinians are always experiencing a situation of discrimination and systematic racism. And this problem comes to the core of Zionism, basically.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I thought it was really good in the film that was all explored and helped people to go on that journey as well. Alice, this is really in a way for you, because it's about the film in the context of America. And Francis wanted to know originally who was the film intended for, and has it had wide circulation? And someone else wanted to know, Lenny, who's actually American but has lived in the UK for a long time. And she wondered if there had been resistance to showing the film in the USA, and was it being accused of being anti-Semitic? So sort of linked to some of the things that we've already said.
Right. So, I'm not the producer of the film. I was in the film, but I understand that the film has been shown all over the country to a variety of different audiences. And, the reactions have been literally all over the place. I mean, a film like this will trigger a huge amount of hostile response from people who don't want to understand the brutality of dispossession and occupation. There are also people who applaud the film and who say, you're showing it how it is, and this is an honest depiction. And I think what Marjorie was trying to do is that the voices of Jewish people speaking out has one kind of power, and the graphic pictures are the lives of Palestinians, and that has another kind of power. So I think she was mixing those two kinds of messages together to produce a film that is not supposed to make people comfortable. I mean, it's supposed to be a bit shocking and a bit like, wake up, this is what's happening. People are dying. People's lives are being destroyed. We can't just sit here and sing Kumbaya and hope that, we'll have a two-state solution and everything will be lovely. This is not what's going on. So I think, as you can imagine, the responses have been all over the place. I don't know particularly if somebody has accused the film of being anti-Semitic, but I suspect people would do that because people confuse criticism of Israeli policy with anti-Semitism. And Israel is a state. It is a state like, Czechoslovakia is a state. We have a right to criticize it when it does terrible things and to support it when it does good things. It is a state. It's not a religion. And so criticizing a state is very different than criticizing Jews for being Jews. And so I think that issue comes up a lot. I mean, it comes up for me, in my speaking and my filmmaking and all that kind of stuff. So all of us on the front lines, and I'm sure all of you have had the experience of being accused of anti-Semitism when what you're doing is criticizing state policies, violations of human rights, ignoring Palestinian aspirations, all the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Yeah. And we won't go into it now, but in the UK context, our Labour Party is riven with trying to understand what anti-Semitism is and different voices in the Jewish community as well. So it's a live issue, isn't it? It's
our State Department has defined anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel as one of the forms of anti-Semitism. And so already from the top, we have a confusion and basically a very dangerous assumption about what anti-Semitism is. And the problem is that there is real anti-Semitism. I mean, there's a big right-wing, force in the United States who are truly anti-Semitic, and that is totally different than people having moral criticisms of the behavior of the Israeli government.
Yeah. Adam, did you want to? Are you all right there?
No, I was just agreeing with Alice. With
great. Yes. Just because you mentioned it, and there are two questions about from Lizzie and again from Frances about the imagery, and particularly the decision, quite shockingly, to include such graphic images, especially of the attacks that killed and wounded children, whereas most other documentaries have not gone that far in portraying life for Palestinians. And I wondered what each of us thought about that, and maybe Pat, you'd like to start with sharing what you thought about the imagery, which was particularly shocking, I think.
Yes. I think I have rather mixed feelings about it. I think I understand, as Alice was saying, the need to kind of create the moral crisis with the film by showing the impact, particularly of violence against children and the military violence and what that's doing to communities. Another side of me is always slightly worried by images that portray people in such a devastating way. And part of me thinks I find the grinding nature of occupation in some ways more shocking than sometimes images of violence being done to people. The daily grind of occupation, of trying to carry out one's life, of moving around, of being isolated, of being cut off, of being totally frustrated in every day of one's life. In some ways, that kind of impacts rather more powerfully on me, maybe, than images that show violence. But I understand the purpose of the film was perhaps to do something else in terms of jolting and creating this moral crisis, and to create the deeper understanding of what occupation is doing every day and how it's grinding people down is a slightly longer term perspective. But so I have mixed feelings about it.
Adam, how did you feel?
Well, thanks for this question because this is something that I was thinking about when I was watching the film. And thank you, Pat, for mentioning this because I was just looking at my bookshelf if I had the book or not. I was looking for The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon because in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon talks about the concept of violence, right? Violence isn't just rockets falling on Gaza. Violence isn't just someone being shot at a checkpoint or being, just harassed at a checkpoint. Violence is also living under occupation, having your identity denied. It is the constant fear of knowing that you're not safe even in your bed, knowing that at any time you could be snatched by soldiers. It is the violence of being stopped from pursuing your academic career, even if you have a scholarship at a UK university. This has happened to my friends who are from Gaza or from the West Bank. And because of the security of the Israeli state, they could not leave, right? So this is also violence. And also the epistemological violence, meaning the linguistic violence or the marginalization of Palestinian voices from the mainstream discourse, is also a form of violence that I experienced, for example, here in the UK. But about the imagery, so this is really important to notice, so this is not the only form of violence that Palestinians experience. But about the imagery itself, I think my biggest concern would be for the people who are in those images. To what extent did their agency, what has it been taken into account? But I think we always need to take a holistic picture. What is the purpose of the film? Is it meant to shake people up, as Alice has said? If that's the case, then we're going to have to make sacrifices on some other things, as is the agency of people in the pictures themselves, or maybe what I was thinking was the limiting of the Palestinian to a victim. But then other parts of the film were talking about the resistance and how people live their lives. So that's in that sense, I was not worried. But it's just about the agency of the people on the pictures. But that is always difficult, and I think it was not a display. It wasn't, sort of meant to. The goal was to shock people and to show them the reality. And let's just remember, they were talking about what happened in 2008, 2009. 2014 was even worse, was incomparable. So if people are shocked by these images, try to imagine living that reality in 2014. Try to imagine living and not being able to get away from it. So that's my opinion. And I think people, if you are distressed by these images, which you should be, then you have to take action and you have to speak up and think critically about what is happening.
Yeah. Alice, did you want to say any more? Any more comment?
Well, I also want to. Sure. Playing off of what you just said, I think that people need to also understand that when there is a huge amount of violence being put upon Palestinians, the Palestinians are always being accused of being violent. And I think part of what Marjorie was trying to show is the Israeli military machine is violent beyond imagination. And that she was trying to get some proportionality here and really show, the context in which it's happening. The other thing I would like to say is that the violence doesn't happen in a still photograph. Every one of those people who suffered those injuries and that trauma has to live with it for the rest of their lives. So we're talking about communities that are resilient, they're creative, they're amazing in what they're able to do, but they're also living with this chronic trauma. And I think that's something else that people need to think about after they get over their shock and horror, is what is the long-term implications of being the kid who saw their father blown up, of being the young man who lost his leg. All the things that you see don't go away. This is now the reality for the future for that generation.
Yes, I think all that's really important. And I think it's part of our model culture, ironically, that even though there is so much civilian death in conflict, that somehow news organizations and media feel the need to protect us from it. And there's often in mainstream news organizations great controversy when something like this is shown. And yet it's the reality, and so it can, maybe it has that purpose of the jolt, of the call to action, because sometimes we do need shocking into doing things because we've not had that experience. But it's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? Now we've got 3 questions, so I'll try, and the ones that were to do with the environment in the US and the UK. So Ruth has asked about opinion changing in the US and the UK, especially amongst young people, and then has also asked, will the Biden presidency change things? And then Vera talked about what can we do in the UK as a much smaller power, and also given that we're leaving the EU, where we may have had joint approaches. And then someone else, Joe asking, particularly because this is a particularly Christian audience, or organisations rather than audience, is there something that Christians can do that would be supportive of the Palestinians? So a few different things about how things are changing. Are young people changing both in the US and the UK? What can the UK do, and what can Christians do? Adam, would you just like to start? Are you okay to start, and then we'll...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll get us started on the young people. I have experience with young people.
Exactly. You're thin on the ground,
Yeah, exactly. I'm a representative of every single young person. I wish. It's just a joke. Anyway, when it comes to stances among young people, on Palestine, and I want to say general progressive political issues, I obviously have a limited sample when it comes to university students. And generally, people, I have to say, are not very educated on the issue. People might have come across it at GCSEs, which is, high school in the US. People might have taken a course at university. They might have seen something go through the news, but there really isn't a massive level of engagement. The positive thing is that people, when you speak to them, they're willing to listen. Especially here on the campus, you get a lot of support for Palestinian human rights, which is obviously very encouraging and always good to see. But in general, I feel that my generation, people who were born after 1995, there is a movement towards being apolitical, staying away from political issues, and I think this is encouraged by the consumerist environment that we are in at the university, for example. Like my union, when you talk about students' union, before I joined university, I imagine, students' union, it's going to be, revolutionary politics and progressive movements and like very engaging conversations. The motto of our students' union is "Love your time at Leeds." What kind of progressive change do you want to achieve if you're just going to love your time here? A lot of struggle is ultimately very rewarding, but it's not pleasant necessarily. And I think if we learned anything from history, it always has to be young people that are heading the struggles towards progressive, right? To be at the forefront of the progressive political movements. Unfortunately, this is not entirely the case, but I think that opinions are changing and people are willing to listen. But it is an uphill battle. But I think that people now, with issues like surrounding about race and decolonization, are willing to listen. And this is the opportunity that we have to seize. We need to connect Palestine to every single other struggle because it is already connected. We just have to draw the lines. Since the 60s and the 70s, there was a connection between Black liberation and Palestinian liberation. And of course, the South African struggle against apartheid, and Kashmir and Palestine right now, and decolonization. For example, I attended a protest at Oxford, which was aimed at, it's called the Rhodes Must Fall protest, and for decolonization, to remove a statue of a colonial slave owner, really, from the University of Oxford. And we talked about Palestine there and we talked about racial struggles, and we talked about Kashmir, because all these issues are connected. We just have to mobilize people to act on them.
Yeah, great, thanks. Alice, what's the American experience? Because I've certainly heard commentators say that young Jewish people have a very different understanding around Israel and Palestine. But, tell us more.
Okay, well, as you know, we are living in a fairly crazy time here after our 4 years of Trump. So I think there are several things going on. The first thing is that there is this huge, powerful evangelical movement that involves youth, that is very reactionary, and that we're not going to count on for anything positive happening. But in the Jewish community, things are much more frayed. So Jews in America, and I think in the world, have tended to be liberal. They've tended to support civil rights and women's rights and been very active in the labor union movement and all those kinds of things. So we have that historical tradition. And now young people are coming up and they're, believing in those kind of values. But they're also seeing that those values don't seem to translate to Israel. So their parents are willing to tolerate things in Israel that they wouldn't tolerate in the U.S. So because of this crisis, the majority of young people do not march in solidarity with Israel, right or wrong, like they used to. And this is freaking out the mainstream Jewish establishment, obviously. So we have birthright programs and all sorts of things to indoctrinate youth, because it's looked at as the problem isn't Israel. The problem is that Israel's getting a bad rap and the messaging is bad, not that the colonization of Palestine is bad. So there's this huge struggle going on in the Jewish community, and the young Jews tend to be leaders in this because they are unable to sort of swallow the contradictions, and also they don't have sort of the post-Holocaust cultural trauma that their parents and their grandparents had. I think we also see on colleges a lot of pro-Palestinian activism, Students for Justice in Palestine, efforts to promote the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, to get their universities to be involved in this. So there's this constant rumble of this happening. And there's a real attempt to make all of that activity illegal under, quote, anti-Semitism, or, college the people who run the colleges are not interested in divesting from things related to Israel. So there's a big struggle going on in colleges as well. The other big thing that's going on in the U.S. is this growing sense of cross-sectional movements that you mentioned before, where there are huge connections being made between Black Lives Matter, which has endorsed a Palestinian solidarity stance, and the struggles in Palestine. Struggles against police brutality, because many of the police in the U.S. have been trained in Israel, or their supervisors have been trained in Israel. So, we've seen in police departments that used to be theoretically to protect the civilian population are now acting more like an occupying force. They're hugely militarized. They have the same kind of equipment that a lot of Israeli border police and soldiers have. They've got the stuff that the Pentagon doesn't want anymore. So, local police may have military vehicles. I mean, we see the militarization of the police. And so their approach to communities that are resisting or communities that are in trouble are more like an occupying force than a force that's supposed to help the community. So there are all these intersectional struggles that are happening that are getting louder and clearer in the U.S. that make it also much more interesting to be part of the movement, because it's not just, the Jews and the Palestinians are fighting over this. It's now, no, this is a movement that crosses lots of boundaries and that many, many people can sympathize with or have some understanding of. And also the whole anti-colonial issue is another intersectional moment.
Yeah. Pat, would you want to say a little bit about perhaps what we might be doing in the UK and, to address the Christian side of it as well, but also on the other things as well?
Yeah, no, well, just affirming the cross-sectional kind of connection thing there, as well as many of our universities having kind of Palestine solidarity groups and networks who have been experiencing a lot of pushback in the last 18 months. There are also many student groups very much involved in the kind of stopping arms sales to Israel kind of campaigning, and I think that's a very good connection to make as well. There's that particular strand. What I want to kind of introduce is another perspective, and Alice may kind of be able to add to this. In our work in Pax Christi, one of the things that we try and do is to uphold and look at and learn from NGOs in Israel that are working to challenge and resist military occupation. So I'm interested, for example, in those groups like Rabbis for Human Rights, Machim Woks, that try and engage with young Israelis inside Israel, but also within the American communities as well, setting up internships, creating exposure programs. And to me, I think they're very important contributions to this thing of raising awareness about what's happening within Israel, and building a deeper kind of sense of empathy and solidarity that gives people the tools and the language and the experience to better campaign and to be better advocates back in their own countries. So I think the role of NGOs is very important in this whole issue of engaging different generations, but the opportunities of working with young people. And I've just read 2 reports from young interns who are working at the moment with Rabbis for Human Rights, and they're making exactly that connection with the Black Lives Matter. They're reflecting back on what they've been doing in the US, and they're seeing what's happening now in Palestine, and they're making that connection very organically. So I think in terms of solidarity and education and building skills that empower people to be good advocates and to take solidarity actions, I think the role of NGOs is quite important in this.
Yeah, that's that. I think that's really, and that kind of links. Maybe we can follow on with this question that someone, Tracy asked about dissent within Israel, and I don't know. It's partly what Pat's saying, really, because one thing she said was the protests by young Americans against conscription and the Vietnam War seemed to have a massive impact on ending the war in Vietnam. Is there any sign of such a movement developing in Israel, or any thoughts on how young Israelis might be helped to face what's happening? I mean, I think Pat's answered that. I don't know whether any of you have any experience.
Sure. So I think the thing to remember about Israel is that, first of all, it's a very diverse country, so we can't make any hugely broad things. But if you look at sort of what are people worried about as Israeli citizens, and we're talking about the Jewish Israeli citizens, not the 20% Palestinian citizens. Right now, a lot of protests are around Netanyahu and his continued hold on power and his, criminality, that kind of stuff. People are worried about the cost of living, finding housing. There are all sorts of social issues that people are worried about. But the issue of the treatment of Palestinians and the fact of the occupation is fairly low in the, Israeli consciousness, if you kind of take a big overall look at it. And so I find that highly problematic. So, the NGOs like B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights and Israel Committee Against Home Demolitions and all those kinds of groups are critically important in documenting what's going on and working with populations like Palestinian populations that are totally disadvantaged within Israeli society. But one of the big issues is that the left in Israel has been so marginalized by the sort of rightward swing. And even the sort of very good liberal leftist organizations mostly are not dealing with the question of Zionism. They're not dealing with the fact that you cannot be a democracy and be a Zionist, that ultimately they're going to have to face this issue, which is a core issue for this country. So for me, the thing that worries me is that Israel needs a civil rights movement, similar to what happened here. And we're, not at the end of we're in the, beginning of our civil rights movement, but that's not happening in Israel. There's not that kind of introspection, even on the left. And until that happens, there's not going to be a recognition of Palestinians as colonized people who have been dispossessed and all that. I mean, we're not even at recognizing the Nakba in Israel. You get it's a criminal to celebrate the Nakba, so or it's a civil offense to celebrate the Nakba. So we're not even at square one. So I think if you look at that fact and the fact that there is a tremendous amount of within their wonderful educational system with all of its resources and there is a real nationalistic streak. There's not an uplifting of the Palestinian story by any stretch of the imagination. That Israeli youth are really, marching with their parents and not and are not having the role that youth in the U.S. are having. And also. If you look at who the babies are, there's a huge percentage of babies are now from ultra-Orthodox families since they have such big families. So if you take that into the next generation, I don't remember the exact numbers, but in 20 years or 10 years or whatever it is, the majority of youth are going to be from ultra-Orthodox families. And, the ultra-Orthodox have not traditionally been a voice of reason and humanity and open-mindedness towards Palestinians. So I think that Israel is in a big muddle, and that's why I don't think change is going to come from within. I think change is going to come from pressure from without, and that is probably the sad fact of the matter.
So kind of moving then sort of back to what someone was asking. So what kind of things, for example, should we be doing in the UK, Adam? Where are our pressure points with the British government? Adam, do you want to start? And then...
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Pat, because this is exactly what we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about the problematic of understanding how low and how unimportant really the Palestinian lives are in Israeli society. It's not because Israelis are somehow different from anyone else. It's because of the propaganda that they've been fed through the education system, as you have mentioned. So exactly, we have to. I think I'm a big supporter of the struggle from within and from without. I think it needs to be a two-way street. But I also think that when we talk about what we can do now here in the UK, how do we pressure the government? It's a really important question, and it has quite a straightforward answer. You support the BDS movement, the BDS movement, which is the call for boycotting, divesting from, and sanctioning the Israeli state until it complies to three very basic demands. Those demands are freedom, justice, and equality. Freedom for the Palestinians who are living under occupation, justice for the Palestinians who've been forced out in 1948 and 1967, and equality for the Palestinians who are living in the state of Israel. We could go, more into these three demands, but I think they're quite self-explanatory and they're quite clear. So what you can do here in the UK, you have to make the best of your privilege and of your voice that you have as a citizen of the UK, or in my case, as a student here. So if you're a student and you're watching this and you're listening, join a Palestine Solidarity Society in your university. Become part of Apartheid Off Campus. Look us up on Facebook. We're just called Apartheid Off Campus, or on the internet, we have a website. We organize talks. We organize campaigns for what we call the Ethical University Campaigns, which aims at ending any institutional links with universities that are contributing in the perpetuation or continuation of war crimes or violations of international law. We also obviously do awareness spreading. We talk about divestment here at the University of Leeds 2 years ago. We've had a successful campaign which resulted in the university divesting from a number of companies, such as Airbus, for example. I think Airbus was one of them. But very importantly, it was in the hundreds of thousands of pounds that these investments were, and they were ended. We still have an investment in HSBC, which is one of the worst banks in the world in terms of human rights violations. Everyone knows that. Join your local Palestine Solidarity group. Write to your MPs. keep yourself informed. And there's also, calls for direct action right now in lockdown. Obviously, that's quite limited. But I'm also an advocate for civil disobedience and direct action. So there's a group that has emerged recently called Palestine Action. And they've been doing some very interesting and I want to say effective actions on sites that include the headquarters of Elbit Systems, which is a company which manufactures drones that are used by the Israeli army. They occupied one of the factories that provide engines for these drones for more than 2 days, and it caused more than 700,000 of pounds in losses for the company. So it really has an impact, So yeah, this is what we can do and what we have to do, really. If anyone who is, I want to say, conscious of their positionality and their privilege here in the UK, and they want to be anti-racist, there's nothing else that you can do than to take action. Anything less than that is not being anti-racist.
Thanks, that's great, Adam. Pat, would you like to add to that?
To say a big yes to all of those things, of course, but just again from a church's perspective, I think the churches have got to use the moral reserve they have as a body that has values and that has a vision of what the world should be. And unless we're using that moral reserve to speak for justice, to speak for equality, then I think we're failing. You'll know that in 2009, the churches in Palestine issued a statement to the world, a Kairos document, saying, the time has come now for the churches globally to be involved in work for change for Palestine. And in 2012, in this country, we produced a kind of a response from the churches in England and Wales, an ecumenical response called A Time for Peace. And out of that, we've been trying to work to get churches engaged in morally responsible investment, looking at both the negative, the divestment and the boycott side of the use of money and resources, but also looking at the positive side of how we can use money and resources positively to encourage peace building and justice work in the region. I think the fact that church leaders now in many of our countries, and speaking of England and the English-speaking world, every year there's a delegation that goes in January to the West Bank and to Gaza, and they are regularly meeting on the ground with people who are involved in campaigning and advocacy work. But the important thing is when they come back to the US or Canada or France or the UK, that they can then become a voice of advocacy, going to their own Israeli embassy, getting their own church constituents to become involved in action for change. I think the churches are important because often they're a target. The churches speak out and immediately they're clobbered with anti-Semitism. And I think they are no longer as afraid as they used to be. I think they've gained confidence and courage. They know now that they have to stand their ground and speak out and get behind the campaigns that you've been speaking about, Adam, and be part of, mobilizing what could be a very substantial constituency into that campaigning work.
Let me just say also, thank you so much. I want to express gratitude and solidarity to all the churches in the UK that have been kind to have their doors open for our meetings and so on, and supporting the Palestinian struggle. Like, it's really important, so thank you all for that.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Adam. That's great. There's really a devil's advocate question. I think that you will have seen that there are critics of the BDS movement because it focuses disproportionately on Israel, say some people. Why do we campaign for boycotts of Israeli goods but not of, say, those made in China? And I think really people are asking those questions because they want help with the arguments. So Alice, do you want to start?
Sure.
Then...
So first of all, I think it's a very good question. And the answer that I have for that is that, first of all, Palestinian civil society has called for the boycott, divestment, and sanction, as we discussed. If there are other calls for boycott, divestment, and sanction from related to other countries that are committing human rights violations, et cetera, then we need to answer those calls as well. The reason there is a particular focus on Israel is that, first of all, from the U.S. point of view, we give $3.8 billion a year to the Israeli government. And Israel, and that's military aid. And Israel claims to be a modern sort of Western democracy. You know, we Western democracies are having our issues, but that's the category they like to fall in. And so the fact that they are presenting themselves in a particular way and behaving in a totally opposite way, and the fact that we provide them with tremendous military and financial support, and then a huge amount of political support. I mean, look what Pompeo is doing, wandering around the West Bank and drinking wine from bottles that have his name on it. I mean, that's outrageous. This is against international law. So Israel is sort of basking in the cover of U.S. politicians and the United States Senate cowardly ignoring human rights violations and all the other stuff and just sending more and more money. And because this is so egregious, and because we are responsible for it, and because the Palestinians are asking for this, I think we need to honor it. And so that's why this is a particular situation, but it doesn't negate responding to other people's calls for BDS if they have them. Then we pay attention to those. I mean, BDS is a strategy, and it's a strategy to move the political discourse in a more positive direction. And what I say to people who object to BDS is, wait a minute, Palestinians respond with slingshots or suicide bombing, and they're totally condemned. Palestinians respond with literature and writing, and they're totally ignored. So here's a peaceful, nonviolent resistance that has been done by Jews fighting the Nazis, people in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why can't they use that too? If you don't give them any options for resistance, how do they resist? Tell me, how do you do it? You know, so I think that BDS is a fabulous strategy because it's a nonviolent resistance movement. And it's something that can be done on the grassroots level. You can go to your grocery store and say, I don't want you to carry Israeli wines because the grapes are grown in Piscot in an Israeli settlement, and that's against international law. Did you know that? You know? And I think that that's sort of the beauty of BDS, is it can be very personalized on the grassroots level. And also that, you know, we're not going to take down the Israeli hummus industry. What we're doing is damaging the reputation of the state of Israel. And Israel needs its reputation. And you can tell how frantic they are about that because Netanyahu said that second to, except for Iran, the BDS movement is the next most dangerous thing to Israel, which is amazing to me because I didn't know we were that powerful. But it means that the Israeli government is really worried about its reputation because ultimately, there's a sense that there's something illegitimate about this particular colonial effort. And I think in their core, many Israelis know this. So they're afraid of the truth of that coming out. So that's partly also what's going on.
Adam, would you like to say anything more about BDS? I think.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Alice. Again, couldn't have said it better. Let me just say one or two words about cultural boycotts, just to expand. Cultural boycotts, I think, are really one of the most powerful ways we can influence the reputation of the state of Israel. And the fact of the matter is, I always get this question, aren't you just picking on Israel? Aren't you just singling out Israel? Well, actually, Israel is singling out itself by breaking international law. If anyone else breaks international law, we will talk about it. And it is not a regular country because there is no other country that breaks the international law in such a way and gets away with it with total impunity from the UN and from the mass media and from countries like the UK and the US. And that is why it's really important that people like artists, like football players, sportsmen, influencers in general, they speak out about this and they refuse, for example, to play in Israel. I will give a prime example of someone who not only stands always on the side of the Palestinian people, but of any other struggle. If you look at Roger Waters, he literally will speak out on any injustice there is, and he will give platform to these voices. I was lucky enough to have that experience myself with him, which was amazing. But cultural boycott is really the strongest thing that we can do and focus on. Put pressure on your football team that might be playing with an Israeli football team. Put pressure on a music festival that might be hosting Israeli artists. Put pressure on your university. And this is, again, directly speaking to my colleagues who are students. Did you know that the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has accommodations for people who come from, let's say, the UK, they stay in this accommodation that is built on stolen Palestinian land, which is illegal under international law. If you stay in that accommodation, you are staying in a settlement. You are contributing, unconsciously perhaps, but you are taking part in a war crime. This is a problem. We cannot have an institution to be partnering with our universities here in the UK that does things like this. It's unacceptable. So start the campaign wherever you are, whatever you want to do. But think about the power that you have here. And know, just as Alice said, Israel is really, really, really sensitive about its reputation. And so are the institutions that you might be trying to target. So it's really important that you understand this power that you have and make the best out of it. And by the way, we are not targeting nationality, we're not targeting identity, we're always targeting complicity. That's the goal. And the goal is for Israel to abide by international law and respect Palestinian human rights. That's it. That's all we want.
Yeah. Pat, did you want to add anything?
Just very quickly, the reason we have to be involved in is that we're part of the problem historically, and we therefore have a moral and a legal responsibility. And I think, secondly, engaging in campaigning around boycotts and investment, creates great opportunities for awareness raising about why we need to do this, what settlements are about, why goods are coming from. So I'm always interested in how we can widen people's awareness by using certain strategies. And completely behind Alice, it is a very wonderful example of non-violence in action, and non-violent strategies should be raised up as an example of how we should all be engaging with this context.
Alice,
can I say one more thing? I also think that it's important to remember that the current situation is not good for Jewish Israelis either. It's not good for their youth to spend, 18 to 22 years old in the military, in a very racist military. It's not good for 18-year-olds to spend hours at a checkpoint with a huge amount of power over women and children waiting to get across, and people trying to get to school and all that stuff. The suicide rate in Israel amongst soldiers is greater than the number of soldiers dying in combat. There's more domestic violence. It's not good for this country to be an occupier. So, for many, many Jews, part of the struggle is to wake Israelis up and say, this is not good for you. You need some introspection here, because you will be a better country and better people if you face this dilemma. So I think it also needs to be looked at in that light.
Perspective.
Yeah. We're coming towards the end of our time. There was one question that we haven't addressed, so maybe we can try and round up by taking this. People were interested again in how they can argue against the need for the separation wall. People have, the Israeli government makes the arguments about they need to feel safe, and they see the Palestinians as a threat. I don't think the questioners are agreeing with that, but they say saying, how can we argue against that? So maybe in sort of rounding up the discussion, perhaps you address that, or anything else that you'd like to say to kind of bring us to a close. Alice, would you like to just say what your arguments are?
This is one of my favorite questions.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian. So the separation wall doesn't separate Palestinian citizens from Jewish citizens. So that's an issue. The separation wall is largely built in the West Bank on Palestinian land. And when the separation wall was begun, it was theoretically in a response to suicide bombing. And that was, I think, around 2002. And if you look historically, the suicide bombing basically stopped, except for rare instances, long before there was much wall built. Okay, and it stopped because militant groups decided that it was not a good strategy to use. So the separation wall has nothing to do with the decrease in suicide bombing. What the separation wall actually is, since it's built largely on Palestinian land, is a massive land grab. It's a walling off of Jews from Palestinians in the occupied territories to make Palestinians invisible. And if you make people invisible, then you don't have to care about them. So I think the separation wall is actually a trigger for more suffering, more dispossession, more depression, more rage, and does nothing towards making Israeli Jews safer. And it is a myth that the suicide bombing stopped because of the wall. So I think that's like a very quick rundown on what the wall is about. Yeah. And it's also appalling. I mean, if you're in Bethlehem, it's like being in a prison. It's an appalling way to make, try to create a political, to improve the political situation.
Yeah. So, Adam, just very briefly, because it's obviously a massive issue, but just a couple of things that you might want to say to round us off.
Sure. No, I agree. Obviously, I agree 100% with Alice. But I would like to add one thing. When people talk about security and safety, the security and safety of who exactly? Who is the one who's living under occupation? Whose voices are we centering the discourse around? Whose lives are we treating as more important than others? Well, I mean, these are obviously questions that are answered very easily. The security state of Israel will always focus only on its objectives. Its objective and its number one policy is the maximum amount of land with the minimum population of the Palestinians and the maximum amount of Palestinians on the minimum space of land. So that's why you closed off Gaza, and that's why you force Palestinians to leave, both because of economic pressures and because of environmental factors, to leave the West Bank. People are leaving the West Bank. Young people are leaving the West Bank because the situation is so hard. You cannot develop a thriving life under this sort of occupation. I will tell you just a small thing. In Bethlehem, close to it, there's a man who refused to sell the land and refused to sell his house to the Israeli authorities. You know what they did? They built a special section of the wall just for his house with a special gate. If someone wants to visit this man, they have to first agree with the Israeli authorities who will open the gate for him. This is ridiculous. But it's about sumud, right? It's about persistence, about resilience of the Palestinian people to stay on their land. But the policy that they're pushing for is for Palestinians to leave, because this is what they want.
Yeah. Pat, do you want to?
No, just again, I would agree. I think walls and barriers are a very cynical way of trying to talk about peace and securing peace. And I think we've got to challenge the way that that's used in the language of peace and security. And I agree with both of our friends. I think what I've heard both of you say is that the potential for a meltdown of hope among Israeli people and among Palestinians is enormous, and the psychological and physical damage that that's doing has to be challenged, and that cannot be safeguarded. That meltdown of hope cannot be approached by building walls, or by military occupation, or by creating fear and generating fear. So we have to really push to reframe the way we understand what peacemaking and security are about for Israel and for Palestine. We have to reframe that whole discussion.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really great way of ending. And I must say, having visited Palestine and Israel, I think if people saw what the wall was like, I think people don't really understand. When I saw it, it's a shocking thing to see how the impact that it has on people's lives. There's so many more things we could have talked about. I had 2 or 3 questions in my back pocket thinking, if we run out of questions, but of course we haven't, because there's so much to say. I want to thank the 3 of you all very much indeed. I think it's been a great discussion, and there's always something new to learn, and I've certainly learned new things as well. And I hope the people who watch the discussion learn more. But also I think it's enhanced what we saw in the film as well, really, and the questions that people had and the things that it raised. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Alice, particularly for joining us from the States.
Yes.
There's always the silver lining in the cloud of COVID is that we can do these meetings across the Atlantic and have someone joining us from America. But thank you very much to Adam from Leeds and bringing that really young person's perspective, and thanks very much to Pat as well with all the depth of your experience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you.
Pleasure.